Bueno, yo antes de presentar a Caitlin quisiera agradecer de nuevo, llevamos así toda la mañana, pero es lo que toca hoy, creo, bueno, pues por haber llegado hasta aquí. Gracias al Museo de América por haberme escuchado. Y bueno, espero que esto sea una experiencia de intercambio interesante para quienes estamos aquí y para quienes nos escuchan. Me toca presentar a Caitlin Timmer Arends. Caitlin es gestora y curadora de colecciones con una larga trayectoria y experiencia. Ha trabajado en el Waitangi Treaty Grounds, el Museo de Waitangi, como manager curatorial y de mediación. Y es ahí donde yo la conocí en el año 2019. Tengo que agradecerle su ayuda en la realización de mi trabajo de campo. Además, ha trabajado en el Pouere Taonga de Nueva Zelanda, Aotearoa, como registradora de la región norte, entre otros puestos. Además, ha liderado el proyecto de almacenamiento de colecciones patrimoniales de la zona norte de Nueva Zelanda, Aotearoa, incluyendo casas coloniales británicas y francesas. Participó en la construcción del Museo Te Kongahu de Waitangi, inaugurado en 2016, el que les mencionaba. Y en la actualidad es la gestora, desde hace muy pocos días, es la gestora de las colecciones y de la exposición en el National Army Museum Te Matatoa, desde donde trabaja para actualizar y descolonizar la Galería de las Guerras de Nueva Zelanda y en Nueva Zelanda, para ofrecer una nueva perspectiva de los conflictos nacionales e internacionales. Muchísimas gracias, Caitlin Engamiji. Bienvenida.
Kia ora, Maria. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi ake ana te atākura, he tio, he hoka, he hauhu, ti hei mauri ora. Kia ora koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou, nau mai haere mai ki te kōrero, Museums, Collections and Memory, Intercultural Dialogues for Decolonisation. Ko Caitlin Timmer Arends taku ingoa, no Aotearoa au. Hello everyone, and welcome to my talk, Museums, Collections and Memory, Intercultural Dialogues for Decolonisation. My name is Caitlin Timmer Arends, and I'm from New Zealand. My talk today will centre predominantly around the work I did at Waitangi Treaty Grounds during the build of two quite new museums. The first is Te Kongahu Museum of Waitangi, and the second is Te Rauaroha Museum of the Price of Citizenship. The image I have up on my presentation was taken on Waitangi Day, the day that acknowledges the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, which is the most recognisable of our foundational documents. The treaty was eventually signed between approximately 542 Māori chiefs and agents of the British Crown at locations around New Zealand. But it was here at Waitangi, on the lawn between the Flagstaff and the Norfolk pine tree, where the treaty was first discussed and signed on the 6th of February 1840. I prepared this talk on the assumption that the history of New Zealand, its discovery and settlement by Polynesians, followed by interactions with European explorers and subsequent colonisation, is relatively unfamiliar to most of you. New Zealand is a country made up of many islands in the South Pacific Ocean. The main three islands are the North Island, South Island, and Stewart Island, or in Te Reo Māori, Te Ika a Maui, Te Waipounamu, and Rakiura. We have just over 5 million people, most of whom live in the North Island, with more than 1 million of those in our largest city, Auckland, or Tāmaki Makaurau. To contextualise our place in the world, we are to the east of Australia and the very far west of South America. While looking for an image to contextualise the size of our country, I found a tweet by former New Zealand Prime Minister Helen Clark, where she shared an image of New Zealand overlaying Europe. The tweet was immediately followed by the reply you can see on the right. I thought it was quite appropriate considering the image in the reply has us overlaying Spain. We are not quite as small as everyone thinks we are, but we are not so large as our Prime Minister thought we were. To bring us back down to the Pacific, in this image you can just see the top of New Zealand there circled in red. Above New Zealand are many of the Pacific Islands, including Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa. It is from the Pacific that the discoverers of New Zealand came. The trend in New Zealand for a long time was, when asked who discovered New Zealand, to answer British sailor and navigator James Cook. And with that answer, you can get a sense that New Zealand was largely colonised by the British. This answer is factually incorrect for two reasons. Firstly, the already settled Māori population inhabiting the country when Cook arrived, and secondly, the fact that Dutch navigator and explorer Abel Tasman beat Cook to New Zealand by 127 years. New Zealand was the last major landmass to be discovered and settled. Māori arrival is dated to about 1,000 years ago, give or take, with discovery credited to Kupe. Tasman sighted the South Island in 1642 and Cook the North Island in 1769. Both of these interactions with Europeans, the conflict and death that resulted, have had overwhelming intergenerational consequences and left trauma in the descendants of these people. This image here is from 1642, produced by Isaac Gesselmans. He entitled it A View of the Murderer's Bay. Due to complete cultural misunderstanding, Ngai Tūmatakokiri and the Dutch met as nations at war. The resulting clash saw 4 of the Dutch crew killed and the bay labelled by Tasman's crew as Murderer's Bay. His ship sailed away and no one from Tasman's crew ever stood on the lands of New Zealand. What is important to take away from this piece of our history is that prior to 1840, Māori, hapu and iwi, subtribes and tribes, were independent sovereign nations. There was no one united Māori kingdom. The perspectives of one hapu or iwi were not reflective of the experiences of those. They did not mirror one another. When we talk about decolonising museums in New Zealand, the most important first step is identifying the local history. Who were the iwi and the hapu? What were their perspectives? Are they still there? Or were they, like Ngāti Tūmatakokiri, defeated through intertribal fighting and their lands absorbed into the winning tribe? Ngāti Tūmatakokiri themselves were far from the first to occupy that land. They had displaced Waitaha, Ngaitara, and Ngāti Wairangi from the early 1600s, and were then themselves defeated and displaced in 1810 by Ngāti Apa ki te Rātō. Now, while Cook's interactions with Māori on the east coast of the North Island resulted in at least one Māori death, his interactions around the rest of the country were not so fraught. Cook had been sailing the Pacific on a mission to map the transit of the planet Venus from Tahiti. Before continuing his journey, he allowed the Tahitian navigator and high priest Tupaia to board his ship. This was invaluable. Polynesian languages are very similar, so even though Tupaia was hundreds of years removed from the Polynesians who settled New Zealand and became Māori, they could still understand each other. The Māori tradition of passing knowledge through oral histories and carvings meant that the voyages their ancestors had taken from their homes in the Pacific were still well known even tens of generations later. Cook thought the welcomes he was receiving at different landing points were for him. I have been reliably informed by descendants of those who met his ship and guided it into anchor that the welcomes were for Tupaia. By the late 1700s, New Zealand was on the world map. People were making their way here, and Māori were making their way out to explore other countries. The result of Cook's relatively positive interactions with Māori across the several voyages he took to New Zealand was the swift arrival of traders, whalers and sealers, and missionaries. First, the Anglican Church Missionary Society, then the Wesleyans, and finally, the Catholic Marist Brothers. The image I have used here is a photo I took earlier this year. It is the second established mission station in New Zealand in the Kerikeri Basin in Northland. Those are the oldest and second oldest buildings in my country. Today, they are known as Kemp House, which is the white building, and the Stone Store, and are owned by Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga. The third oldest building is at Waitangi Treaty Grounds. It was my responsibility to care for it for over 8 years and was the original museum at Waitangi, but I will come back to that a bit later. To establish and maintain a mission station, the missionaries had to be on good terms with the chief of the tribe in whose area they settled. There were often negotiations that took time and effort on both the part of the chief and their tribe and the missionaries. Everything was governed under Māori customary law, tikanga. Generally, the mission stations were established next to the pā, fortified village, of the chief, or the kainga, village, that the local hapu, sub-tribe, lived in. This mission station was directly under Kororibo pā. If the photo continued further to the left, the remnants of the pā could be seen up on the hill. The establishment of a mission was in no way a guarantee that it would remain an established and active mission. When the first Wesleyans arrived, they were told by the Anglicans how to establish the relationship and the importance of maintaining it. The first Wesleyan missionaries did not heed this, and they were run out of their mission in Kaiō on the upper east coast of Northland, all the way across to the west coast. Relationship building and maintenance has been a cornerstone to the colonial settlement of New Zealand since the beginning. It has, however, been something that was forgotten about on one side, that of the colonisers. Once established and in great numbers, maintaining the relationships stopped. The legacy of that has been almost 200 years of grief, hardship, anger, and distrust. For museums in New Zealand, there has been generations of mistrust. We were seen as Pākehā or non-Māori colonial institutions that took their taonga, their treasures, and locked them away in boxes or glass cases. Our experts, like archaeologists, went and fossicked through their traditional lands, discovering and taking things away to museums. The objects, the taonga, were removed not only from their place of creation, destruction, or burial or abandonment, but taken away from their context as well. Why were they there for our archaeologists to discover? What did they mean in the context of the wider landscape, culturally, spiritually? Why was it more important for them to be taken away and kept in boxes, often never going on display, than leaving them in their cultural context? Some things had been loaned or given to museums far away from their source communities because they were the only ones to exist at the time. By the time it came time to build the museum at Waitangi, we had so much work ahead of us. The legacy of the historic site compromised our relationships with the hapu Ngāti Kawa and Ngāti Rāhiri. They had, in 1833, allowed a representative of King William IV of Great Britain to live at Waitangi. They had been signatories to a letter to the king asking him to send someone to help maintain law and order amongst the high European population in the Bay of Islands. His name was James Busby. He built his house overlooking the bay, which I've circled there in green for you. It had a view all the way out into the Pacific Ocean. I could talk a lot about Busby, but for the purposes of this talk, I will just talk about his acquisition of land. He acquired over 9,000 acres of land from his arrival at Waitangi in 1833 until land sales were halted in 1840 in order to investigate the legitimacy of the sales. European concepts and ideas of sale and possession were being applied to Māori land with its own established system of ownership. Where Busby could not prove purchase to the inquiry's satisfaction, the land did not pass back into Māori ownership. Instead, it passed to the new colonial government. That was one historic reason for the compromised relationship with the local hapu or sub-tribes. Another was that Waitangi Treaty Grounds is owned and governed by the Waitangi National Trust. In the 1930s, the land had been divided up and for sale for a very long time. The Governor-General at the time, the King's representative in New Zealand, purchased the land privately and established the trust. However, some of the land had already been purchased by families who had built homes and were living on the land. The government stepped in and evicted them using an Act of Parliament so that the Waitangi National Trust had all the land once you crossed the bridge. So everything on the right side of the Waitangi River that you can see up there on the slide has been removed from traditional ownership and occupation of Ngāti Kawa and Ngāti Rāhiri. That is just one of the examples of what we had to overcome. It's hard to see in the trees if you don't know what you're looking for, so I've circled the location of the museum there in green. Te Kuangahu Museum of Waitangi opened at dawn on the 5th of February 2016. It tells the history of New Zealand from first discovery and arrival of Māori all the way through to present. It tells a big story in quite a limited amount of space. The way we ascertained what needed to be included was it local? And if it wasn't local, was it of national significance? Luckily, the answer to the first question was often yes. By virtue of being located where most of the major interactions and settlement happened prior to 1840 and the signing of the treaty, almost everything in the first 2/3 of the museum was local. The first major gallery was all about dialogue. Called Kānohi ki te Kānohi, or face to face, the first major gallery has two faces or two perspectives on every moment of history. Te Pahi and Governor Grey, Te Uri o Kānai and Samuel Marsden, Hongihika and King George IV. Now, because I know the image permissions of all the museum content off by heart by virtue of constantly denying requests for publishing the images, The images inside the museum are a bit limited, so you will just have to go to New Zealand and see the museum for yourself. A hugely important dialogue that was the focus of the museum was the incredibly contentious Treaty of Waitangi. In this image, you can see a close-up of one of the roughly 542 signatories on one of the 9 treaty sheets. In 1835, the chiefs of the United Tribes of New Zealand, only established following growing European impact on Māori and predominantly comprised of only northern chiefs, wrote and signed a Declaration of Independence. Its name is He Whakaputanga o Te Rangatiratanga o Nutireni. This declaration was sent to and acknowledged by King William IV. Due to some fallout from the Congress of Vienna following the Napoleonic Wars, his acknowledgement that New Zealand was an independent country for which sovereignty lay with the Māori chiefs meant that the rest of the parties to the Congress of Vienna, most of the major European powers, had to recognise us as independent too. This declaration was why a treaty was needed when Britain turned its attention to formally creating a colony under Queen Victoria's reign. Agents of the Crown were sent to New Zealand to negotiate and sign a treaty. The draft was finalised in English in James Busby's house and given to local missionaries to translate into Te Reo Māori. All negotiations and conversations happened in Māori about the contents of the Māori version. Over 500 of the signatures are on the Māori version. It stated that Māori would retain their sovereignty. The English version did not. It stated that Māori would have all the rights to their taonga. The English translation on this word was not all-encompassing, and so the English interpretation was treasure. The spirit of the translation had been lost, and it was not clear that Māori were including so much more than jewellery or small precious things. The third article was the same in both languages, however, it was not acted on in good faith. Māori were to be given all the same rights and duties as the citizens of England. This third article is important to the build of the second museum, so we'll come back to that a bit later. When the museum was being built, meetings with the Waitangi Tribunal were happening all over Northland. People were attending to give evidence of breaches of the treaty. They went on for some time, and when the first report was published, it was clear Māori did not cede their sovereignty to the British Crown. A wildly contentious concept in New Zealand today. I will not get into politics, but if you're interested, there's a lot of information coming out from our current government on their thoughts on this. Regardless of the thoughts and feelings of our visitors, this was now a fact that had been established in evidence with a body that itself had been established under an Act of Parliament. I told my team, who were responsible for giving tours to about 50,000 people a year, to include it in their tours. My Māori staff jumped on board. Most of them had been saying it anyway. They were descendants of treaty signatories. My non-Māori staff got a lot of pushback from non-Māori visitors. The general consensus was that descendants of colonisers should agree with the colonial legacy left by their ancestors. It was difficult to navigate. However, with the support of their Māori colleagues, they stood strong on what they knew was right. Something important to include was this quote from Queen Elizabeth II's 1990 visit. Today we are strong enough and honest enough to admit that the treaty has been imperfectly observed. I look at it as a legacy of promise. It can be a guide to all those whose collective senses of justice, fairness and tolerance will shape the future. Now that's an apology in Queen speak. It doesn't sound like one, but it's the only apology that Queen Elizabeth ever made on behalf of her ancestors. Opposing her quote are the words of Sir James Henare. Ko tāwhiti ki tō haerenga mai kia kore e haere tonu. He hui rawa o mahi kia kore e mahi tonu. You have come too far not to go further. You have done too much not to do more. The museum ends on a pounamu, or green stone touchstone with water. The museum is filled with a heavy history, with sacred objects, words and people. To touch the water is to cleanse yourself and leave all of that heaviness behind. In 2019, Waitangi was part of the official visit by the then Prince Charles and Duchess of Cornwall, now King Charles and Queen Camilla. The Royal Collection asked if there was anything we would like as a gift from the collection, really a long-term loan. What arrived was an enormous korowai, a tasselled cloak. In the photo on the left, I am carrying it in behind the king into the meeting house. I had blonde hair there. On the right was later in the day when I had 45 minutes to give him a tour of the museum. I included this image because it shows the chair. Carved by Māori in the South Island in the early 1930s as a gift to the Waitangi National Trust, it was made to look like a Māori version of the coronation chair that dates to 1296, that interestingly King Charles would sit on at his own coronation not too long after this photo was taken. The chair in this photo is an example of cultural dialogue through art. Māori craftsmanship and artistry coming through into a chair modelled after one used to crown the very royal family that oversaw the colonisation of New Zealand. It took a while to get the korowai on display in the museum. It is 2 metres by 2 metres and very heavy. It was gifted to Queen Victoria in 1863 on the Isle of Wight by Reihana Te Taukawau. He didn't have any children, but the descendants of his brothers and sisters were there to meet King Charles and welcome the korowai home. In fact, it took so long to get the korowai on display that we opened a second museum in the meantime. Te Rau Aroha Museum of the Price of Citizenship took the third article of the Treaty of Waitangi, the same rights and duties of the people of England, and explores the topic through military service. Every story in the museum is an example of Māori commitment to upholding their obligations in the document of partnership, the Treaty of Waitangi, even when the other partner has forgotten. The museum has a large focus on the 28 Māori battalion who served in the Second World War. We broke ground on the museum site on the 5th of February 2019, and in a year to the day, the 5th of February 2020, the museum opened. It was an intense year with a lot of hard work and long hours, but we got it done within the year. The museum features 3 main galleries, focusing on Māori service in the New Zealand Wars that began within 5 years of the signing of the treaty, the South African War, World Wars I and II, and more contemporary conflict. It also focuses on the legacy of conflict on those that serve and those that remain behind. The more contemporary nature of this museum subject matter meant that in some instances we did not have to work to interpret the soldiers' war experiences. Instead, we included audio recordings of them talking about their experiences themselves. We did not work to censor their experiences, nor try and create any sort of narrative to group their experiences together. Even soldiers who fought side by side in the same moments of conflict had differing experiences and memories. The second gallery is a large memorial space with photographs, or space for photographs, for every northern member of the 28 Māori Battalion, as well as every name on the nominal rolls for the Māori Battalion of World War II and the Pioneer Māori Battalion of World War I. Due to cultural sensitivities, they do not and will not show the faces of the soldiers in any photography that is available from Waitangi. Photography is banned in the gallery, however, that does not stop people from taking photos of their relatives and sharing it widely. In this image, you can see the 2 walls of photographs blurred out behind the memorial sculpture, which is made up of over 7,000 individual pieces of timber to represent Māori soldiers who served in theatres of war. In the centre of the structure is a glass display case containing soil from Monte Cassino in Italy, where many Māori Battalion soldiers lost their lives. Whenua, or land, is an important connection for Māori. Where you come from is part of how you introduce yourself to others. For the Māori who fought and died in Italy, bringing some of the soil in which their remains lay home to New Zealand for the museum was hugely significant. The third gallery is specifically dedicated to the northern soldiers in the 28 Māori Battalion. You can see in the image on the left that the top of the North Island has been coloured. These colours are the different tribes from which the soldiers came. The Northern Company stretched down to Auckland, in there in blue at the bottom with Ngāti Whātua written next to it. In the image on the right is my mother and brother, actually, delving into the research computers. This gallery was a labour of my love. For months, I attended hui, or organised meetings, with descendants of the soldiers and their families. I sat at the back and scanned photographs they brought to share, took note of objects they brought with them, talked to so many people about the purposes of the museum. Earlier in my talk, I mentioned the generations of mistrust with museums just taking. That was a huge thing I had to overcome at these hui. I spent a lot of time reassuring the people that we did not want to take their objects and own them, but rather, if they were willing to lend them to the museum, it would be for a specific purpose, with a loan agreement governing the conditions of their deposit, as well as our responsibility as a museum to uphold the agreement. I printed more sample loan agreements for people to take away with them and read over than I have ever printed anything in my life, but it was worthwhile. I sat on the floor of the great-granddaughter of Captain Harding Leaf, who served in both World War I and World War II. I itemised, photographed and catalogued his war trunk. Over 120 personal items that had been returned to Harding's son after he had been killed in action. Those objects are now on display in that museum, in the gallery in these photos. The relationship with the Leaf family became one of the strongest I established and maintained. They advocated on my behalf, on behalf of the museum, to people who were sceptical of the museum and of the honesty of Waitangi, and also of my ability to care for their histories, memories, and objects when I am not Māori. In the years after the museum opened, delayed by COVID, a documentary was made about Harding's life and service. It featured the hikoi, or pilgrimage, of the Leaf family to the museum to remember and honour their ancestor. Called Kia Mate a Ururoa, The Shark of War. The documentary was released in 2022. I was honoured that the family asked me to feature to tell the story of how the museum worked to loan the remnants of Harding's life at war. Now, I have included this slide just for balance, as we're talking about dialogues. Previously, you saw the photo of me with King Charles, so now here is a photo of me with the recent Māori King Tuheitia, who just passed away, and his daughter, the new Māori Queen, Ngā Waihono ki te pō. Earlier, I told you that prior to 1840, Māori were not a united kingdom. Still true today, but some tribes formed the Kingitanga, a king movement, in the 1860s in an attempt to have a contemporary to speak sovereign to sovereign with Queen Victoria. Both Tuheitia and Ngāwai are descendants of the first Māori king, Pōtatau Te Whirowhiro. I recently started a new job as the Collections and Exhibitions Manager at the National Army Museum Te Matatoa. In fact, this week is my third week in the role, so I am very grateful they allowed me to take leave to come here and participate in the seminar. The museum has been open since the 1970s, and in many cases that is the age of the exhibitions too. Much has changed in the 50 years since the exhibitions were first curated. We have learned more about our history, we have grown and developed in our understanding of conflict and the role we as a country play in it. We have changed the language we use to talk about war. We have acknowledged that there is more than one perspective to our past. Part of my new role is to manage the teams responsible for updating and refreshing the exhibitions. Work is already underway on the New Zealand Wars Gallery, which in the past has been described as offensive, racist, dated, and embarrassing. I use quotation marks on all of those words as I'm quoting people's reviews of the gallery. I visited the museum back in 2022 and was a bit horrified by the content of the exhibition. Through my work at Waitangi, the New Zealand Wars is an area of our history I consider myself well versed in, the northern conflicts predominantly, but I know a lot more than the average New Zealander about the rest of the conflicts as well. To know that the Army Museum has recognised the need to refresh the exhibition and has started on it already is heartening. The fact that they are following what I would say are the 5 key tenets to decolonising a museum shows that more museums know they need to grow and change as our society grows and changes. They are currently up to step 2. I have talked about all 5 of my key tenets to decolonising a museum through my talk, but to summarise, know your history, build relationships, maintain those relationships, be open to other interpretations or perspectives of history, value Indigenous knowledge and how it is passed down. Don't decide that because it wasn't written, it doesn't carry the same authority. And finally, a hugely important point to me, who looks so much like a remnant of New Zealand's colonial past, is that it is up to everyone to do the work to decolonise museums. It's not a weight that rests on the soldiers of Indigenous museum staff alone. Kia ora, thank you.